Happy July.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're Bill and I are at a special vacation edition.
Secret undisclosed location.
And so we don't have our regular setup here.
Yeah.
But we decided to take a little time.
Take a little work with us on vacation.
Yes, exactly,
enjoy.
because we didn't want to cancel on you. So we're going to do a Quilts First Live, talking about contrast and color. And those are often overlooked concepts that are really important in every quilt. So we'll go through your questions as well. So feel free to add your questions in the chat and let us know what's challenging for you. We've already gotten some of the questions off of Instagram and Facebook already. So
and contrast for us, as you'll see by the end of this discussion, contrast is something that is essential to almost every quilt we make, and is such a broad. Should we
but
just
it needs to be handled intentionally, and there isn't a one size fits all kind of approach.
So I think it would be helpful if we just start kind of giving an explanation of what we mean by contrast.
Actually,
Tag, you're it.
No, I was going to say, do you want to go through just a quick hue, value, and saturation? So we're all using the same words here. So
the first thing that I want to say with contrast, a lot of people think, older folks like me, think of contrast as back when you had the black and white TV, and you could alter the contrast, which heightened the difference between the whites and the blacks. But it's much more than that, especially in quilting.
Can you slow down for just a little bit? I know you're excited.
And contrast is simply difference. And it can be difference of hue, it can be difference of scale. We'll break it down in just a moment. But I do want to start out by saying that contrast is not inherently good or bad. This is kind of value neutral. It's that when making a quilt, we always think about contrast in terms of, do we want it, do we not, and how much? So now we can break down the different elements maybe.
Oh, okay. So you're not gonna.
Oh, well, you have a list.
Yeah.
She has a list on.
Okay, so the first, in order to make sure that everybody hello from Door County, in order for everybody to make sure that you can get the most out of this, we need to agree on 3 terms that are using color theory and they're essential to talking about.
And we do this every single time we talk about color.
Contrast. So the first one, we don't have our color wheel here, but the first one is hue, and that is the part of the light spectrum that you see. It's red, blue, green, and there are an infinite number on the color wheel, and you don't need to know the color wheel or be an expert to follow this, but we need to differentiate between the blue and green, for example, which is hue, and value, which is the lightness or darkness of the hue. And then saturation, which is the intensity or the purity of the hue. Do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, saturation, quilters often refer to as brights or muddies. So it's the intensity. Dusties.
Yeah.
So when we talk about contrast can be contrast of hue, red versus blue, which are distinctly different. But if you have something like red and orange, there's not as much difference, so it's a lower contrast.
So let's back up a little bit. When we're talking about the color wheel, we talk about analogous, which are colors that are next to each other on the color wheel. So that would be yellow, orange, green, blue, blue, purple, that kind of thing. And complementary, which are across from each other. So that would be red and green, blue and orange, yellow and purple. So those are just the kind of general framework for this discussion that I think you'll find helpful to have.
And the other general framework, I think, is that our brains have evolved to be attuned to contrast. Contrast is something that lets us get through the day. As I often tell people, if you're sitting here watching this right now, my guess is you're sitting down and you were able to look at the chair or the sofa and sit on it because it was different from the floor, from the wall. Your brain could see the edges, whether it's a different color, a different shape. There's something that chair contrasted with its surroundings. And patchwork is about sewing one piece to another. And when you do that, you're always asking yourself, are you trying to see the pieces or make them blend together? And I think it might really help to just pick one quilt to demonstrate this, if that's okay. Or do you want to?
You're going in a totally different direction than I
different.
planned, but
Okay.
okay. So, but go ahead. You've got some.
See, this is
undisclosed plan.
No, this is just how I think of contrast.
Yeah.
So, and we have a quilt. Ooh. This is our Chevron quilt, and this, if I remember correctly, is 12 different fabrics.
You've got it on the side too.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So this would be a low contrast quilt. It's often called a low volume quilt, where there isn't a tremendous amount of contrast among all of the fabrics. There is enough that you can see the pattern, but it's very different from the quilt behind us, which is our picnic quilt. And you can see, for example, the dark blue is really a different value contrast than the yellow, for example. It's also a different hue contrast. So that's why there's a very graphic feeling to the quilt behind us that is less so in this quilt because there's less contrast.
Whereas there are two groups of fabrics. There are the very light fabrics, kind of ecru, light gray, pale blue, celadon, that they are similar in value, similar in saturation. So when they're next to each other, they read as one big stripe.
Yeah, all of these.
There you go.
Because they have the same relationship. Now I'm going to pause here and just ask you, can you just in the comments section, please, tell me whether or not this is making sense or whether we need to back up and review this again, because I don't want to get too far into the weeds if this isn't clear yet. So if you're watching, if you can just type into the chat section whether this is making sense or whether we need to go into this a little bit more. But part of the reason I think that this conversation is so important, yes, makes sense. Good. Okay, because there are a lot of people out there who teach quilting, who say, is a one-size-fits-all approach, that you need to have a light, medium, and dark in every quilt. And we don't agree with that. I think that that's shorthand for unique contrast.
Yeah.
But this is an example where there's a light and then a medium light, and there is no dark. And that's very intentional. And that creates a very calming, when there's less contrast, it's a more of a calming feel to the quilt.
So I think this Chevron quilt, which is from a Quilter's Guide to Solids, I think what makes it work is the grouping, that the medium value fabrics all have to be similar enough that they read when they're put together as a continuous band when they're placed next to the lighter ones. So there are two groupings. Within each group, there's not much contrast, but there's sufficient contrast between the two groups that you get this chevron effect.
So I want to back up and say that one of the things that you can do to make life easier for you and to make quilts that make your color work easier is to look at a pattern and make a determination as to what are the roles of contrast in this quilt. So, for example, in this quilt, there are two groupings, as Bill said. So you'll often see in the pattern, they'll be differentiated between 10 lights, 10 darks, or something like that. But all of these need to be treated as one value. So that's the lightness or darkness. So they look unified. And the same thing with these. The relationship between this one and this one needs to be the same as this one and this one. Mm-hmm. And so having really clear definition between your groupings is a way to have good contrast.
Yeah, so that word role, I think, that you use is so important. What is the role of each fabric? Because I agree. I think sometimes when people are fabric shopping and they have a pattern, they're just seeing that it says get 6 blues and 5 greens or something. But if you actually take a few minutes to look at the quilt and just kind of think it through before you go shopping and think that, yeah, there are blues and greens, but what are the roles? Do those blues all have to be similar? Should they be very different in brightness or value and, you know, saturation? And I think that role it's critical.
Now let's compare it to Picnic Behind Us, because Picnic Behind Us has a wider so in this Chevron quilt, there's 2 different roles, right? And so you have 2 different very distinct values, lots of hues, but the same values.
And the same saturation.
And
They're
the same
all
saturation.
Very desaturated.
But in Picnic, we have a wide variety of hues and similar saturations, but a narrow range of, well, I guess a medium range of values, from the lightest being the yellow to the darkest, which is the kind of charcoal gray back there.
And there's a little range of saturation, that the yellow is the most saturated and the grays are
and the reds are
and
too.
the reds are desaturated. So there's a vibrancy to it that also allows each block to stand out from the one next to it. They don't all blend together, but we kind of played with that contrast a bit, because if you look at this, for example, this is a pale gray center and a desaturated blue outer. So it's subtle, whereas the one next to it, you have high contrast in hue and in value. So there's kind of a push-pull going on. The role of each fabric here is to kind of interact with the fabric next to it.
Well, I think that what's really important is, if you're looking at the Picnic quilt, for example, that you look at the fact that the role of the inner and outer fabric is really what's critical here. So when we're pairing these, you know, I think many people would try to pair nice colors, you know, in a
Nice,
triangle.
yeah.
So they might pair like a red and a pink next to each other, but those would be colors that are very similar, so you'd have less contrast between the center and the outer part, but then you'd have a lot of contrast with the next one that might be light blue and dark blue, for example. And what we find helpful in this kind of quilt is not making the centers and then the outer edges the same, because you're trying to integrate the entire palette, and you have to force yourself to piece fabrics with good contrast so it doesn't get mushy, visually mushy.
And it's okay, like we occasionally, like I said, here or here, we occasionally have some fabrics that don't have as much contrast in the center, just to break it up and pull you in. But if they were all like that, you wouldn't see it. And we often say, like, what's the point then? You know, if quilting is about cutting up fabric and sewing it back together, you kind of want to see what you've done.
Well,
unless,
I was going to say, are you finished?
Yeah.
Okay. I was going to say, you know, I think that there is a wide range of, like, contrast is an incredible tool, and you can use it for whatever end you want. So you can go higher contrast like this, or if you want to do some kind of color wash, or what used to be known as watercolor quilts, but now they're fades or color washes, and that is an intentional mushing together of hues and a very gradual transition between light and dark.
So you're not paying attention to the individual piece so much, and more the overall effect.
Well, you're
transition.
looking for the equal amounts of contrast between each individual piece.
So no one piece stands out. So you see the fade as a whole rather than the individual pieces.
Yeah, I was going to see whether we had rank and file, a picture of rank and file.
I don't think we have that issue with us.
Okay, well, let me see. I also wanted to show an example of, hold on, like our treasure quilt from Modern Quilts Illustrated 15. So you can see each of these bands has a similar increment of change in value. So that enables you to have gradual, like a small amount of contrast, but it's equal between lines. So what Bill was saying earlier of the point of patchwork is to be able to see.
Maybe, it depends.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
This is the other end of the spectrum.
Yeah. And do you want it or do you not?
Yeah. And so Katsura would be another example.
Oh, I actually
yes,
bought that.
Kathy, I've got the picture right here.
I've got the quilt too.
Oh, okay.
I brought that.
Let me give them the yes. Let me just give you the picture. Probably the illustration is the easiest to see. So you can see from the color variations, and this is in Modern Quilts Illustrated 10, that
cover shot shows
you can choose to have a lot of contrast, or you can make it softer. And we chose a medium amount of contrast, I would say.
So if you look, the squares there, I'm wiggling my finger closest to Weeks.
This one?
Have the lowest amount of contrast until you get up close. And there, the contrast is something we haven't talked about yet. It's contrast of scale. It's a medium to large scale print with a smaller scale one.
In saturation, because this is, so, and this is kind of a quick segue. I'm going to sprinkle in throughout our chat here some of the questions we've gotten from you on our social media platforms. And one of them would be, actually there's probably two combined. Should I be taking a picture with my phone and switching it to black and white? / do you use any value, the red glasses or the red thing, the red filter that people look through? And for me, that question is kind of like somebody, like a child asking me, should I learn how to do arithmetic on a calculator, or should I memorize a times table? Because I feel like once you insert some other device into the process, you are making it more difficult to train your own eye. And all of you have the ability to learn how to see it. And I would rather you see it than rely on some other device that actually distorts.
Well,
there's so many reasons that the phone black and white thing just, it doesn't work.
What Weeks is talking about with either the red filter or the black and white, is those are tools to help you see value differences.
Right.
So light versus dark. The disadvantage of that is it eliminates any saturation differences. So sometimes there'll be a fabric that's too saturated or too dull.
And it will look fine.
And it'll look fine in black and white.
Or with the red value finder thing.
And, I think
So then I think that sets you up for frustration because you're like, well, it looks fine here. Why does it, but in person it doesn't. And then on top of that, your phone is this big and you're making like a queen size quilt or something and you're trying to figure it out. You're not going to look unless you're sending it unless you're posting it on Instagram or something. It's going to look different on your phone than it does in person in terms of scale and in terms of saturation and color and everything.
When things are shrunk down to the size of a phone, it absolutely changes how you see contrast and
even photography itself. That we have as publishers, we have to think about how a quilt is going to look in print, shrunk down, and I sometimes bemoan the fact that we have to make design decisions based on how things are going to photograph. And there have been times that we have not used certain fabrics because we're like, it's not gonna photograph well.
So it's very different. If you're doing a quilt, if it's a quilt for a commission or a friend, we don't have to worry about that at all. But if it's going to be a quilt that we know will be published, there are certain things we have to think about. And ultimately the quilt has to be something that the user loves, but there is that issue of if it gets scaled down. And even this quilt is a good example that in person, the little violet and red, which is probably the hardest checkerboard to see on screen, in person is pretty clear.
It's very clear.
Very clear.
So the thing is, I guess, I feel like we should always have a disclaimer on the beginning of every video, which is, if these tools work for you and they're helpful to you, absolutely use them.
Yeah.
But if you're asking me, do I think that it's going to be helpful to you? I want to encourage you to have confidence that this is something that you can learn to see and that you don't need these other tools, because I actually think it's easier to see it directly. Having said that, I will say it's easier to see from 10 feet away than up close.
Yeah, and we talk about that all the time teaching, that the 10-foot rule, always step away from your work because you do see things differently up close and far away. And when we're designing our quilts, we do think about how you see it when you walk into a room, how it looks when you get up close, and then we want you to be rewarded by detail when you get very close. So we're thinking about multiple distances, and contrast, again, plays a very big role in that. I find contrast to be endlessly fascinating, and it's one of the reasons we loved making this Katsura quilt.
It was hard though.
One of the things that's very hard about this is when you see the overall picture, it looks like, oh, it's a lot of fabrics, but not until you actually look at the count. It's 50 pairs, is that right?
Yeah, I can't remember
or
off the top of my
fabric,
head.
20,
yeah.
It is a lot, 25 pairs maybe, 50 fabrics I think, and which is a lot of fabrics because they all have to work together. They have to all work in individual checkerboards.
I can't see it. I can't count off the top of my head, but
yeah.
But one of the other reasons I wanted to talk about this is that a friend of mine spent 4 years making a quilt, and the precision in the handwork was perfect, and it was so beautifully composed and executed. And then she hated it after 4 years of
That's hard.
handwork. It was hand applique. She said she just realized that there wasn't enough contrast, and she was looking at an arm's length
And she was doing all the handwork.
and making all the decisions for all this hand applique, and it looked like lots of lots of contrast when she was looking at it at this length. But as soon as she stood back, she realized, and actually when she took a picture of it, a color picture of it, she realized that there wasn't enough. And go ahead.
I was going to say that the reverse, I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but where contrast can be a problem, I was one of 3 judges for one of the big AQS show. I think it was an AQS show. It was one of the big national shows.
Yeah.
AQS, I can't remember. And we got to the applique category, and there was a stunning quilt. It probably had 1,000 hand applique leaves on it. The color work was fantastic. The craftsmanship was like A+. However, there was a border, and inset before the first border was an almost neon green bit of piping. It was maybe 1/8 of an inch, and it was exquisitely done. However, it was by far the brightest thing in terms of saturation in the whole quilt. And from 50 feet away, all you saw, it looked like it had been plugged in. And when you got up close, it was very distracting. And all 3 of us as judges, I was kind of a modern judge, there was a traditional judge and an art quilter, and all 3 of us said, oh, what a shame. This one detail pulls all your attention away from like everything else.
And that quilter probably added that, thinking it was going to add a little punch of color or something,
And it was just
pop
like,
of color, and it was
too much.
Too much, yeah.
And again, it was because it contrasted. There was nothing else that was as bright. And actually also it was the thinnest element, so that also makes it stand out. It was piping. Everything else was pretty much 2-dimensional. Piping is 3-dimensional.
Piping is tricky.
And
it's really tricky.
I'm not I don't think there is anything inherently wrong with piping or inherently wrong with using kind of neon colors occasionally, but you have to know how they interact and how they contrast with the rest of the quilt. And it just became the one element that was like,
well, and then one of the things I wanted to say about contrast is that, especially if it's applique, but also it can be piecing as well. Contrast there's a relationship between the size of the piece and the contrast needed.
yes.
So typically, if you're using little tiny stems, for example, on applique, you're going to need them to be a little bit higher in contrast than you do big checkerboards, for example, because if it's a big, massive piece, you're going to be able to see those edges a lot more easily.
We often say to each other, it's all about edge. Do you want the edge?
Yeah.
Do you not want
Whereas
the edge?
if you've got some little stem on, some piece of applique, so this is...
Let's go high contrast of value. Whoops. And as long as we're talking about applique, sorry. This is good fit, which is issue 2, on the cover of issue 2 of Modern Quilts Illustrated. And the entire idea behind this is that if you take a bunch of ovals and so applique one down and then another, so they're just touching. These are all hand appliqued and then machine quilted. And we wanted people to be able to see just the very point or the tangency where they touch. And to be able to see that, we needed high contrast.
Yeah.
So this is an off-white.
It would not be good in pastels. It would be lost.
You would lose that edge. And
So part of this whole discussion is that there isn't a right or wrong or one size fits all in terms of contrast, but it's learning how to see what shapes and what patterns and what fabrics need more contrast and which patterns and types of quilts you want less contrast. And less contrast is typically calmer, but it can really, you can lose all of the form that you've pieced in or appliqued in if you don't have sufficient contrast. Yeah. And you can also have major problems if the fabrics and the rolls of the quilt aren't equivalent, or that there's one that pops out too much within a grouping. That can also create problems visually.
It can really create problems. Now, the flip side, and actually I see Karen, you made this. Yay!
Oh, good.
I hope you enjoyed making as much as I love making
Bill
this.
is the king of needle turned applique.
Well, not only that, but I just like picking the fabrics. These were just scraps from our stash.
Yeah.
But I just thought of another example of contrast where we were teaching, and I was working with a student who had gone through a lot of medical challenges and had a lot of medical procedures, and said she felt totally like a number. She felt very dehumanized by the process. And part of the piece involved appliquing numbers, but it wasn't like if she was patient number 14, let's say, she didn't just put a black 14 on white. She had the 14 out of fabrics that almost looked exactly the same. They were almost impossible to see. They were a print, and she put them on top of another print. And the idea was, not only was she a number, she was a number that you couldn't even see. And so this was a conceptual quilt. It wasn't meant to be, it reflected how she felt. And it reminded me a lot of the color blindness tests, where someone who's colorblind can't see what the shapes or the numbers are because things blend together in value. So that was a time where she harnessed the power of contrast, the lack of contrast, to serve her idea.
Right, and that's what watercolor quilts and the color wash quilts and that kind of thing are. So I want to get to a couple of other questions that came on Facebook and Instagram. One of them was that one quilter said she loves adjacent, so analogous colors, like blue and red, or I'm sorry, like blue and green, or red and orange, but she doesn't like complementary colors. And how does she get contrast needed for quilts if you're doing an analogous palette? And I was going to see whether you could get right down there that party of four.
Yeah, and also, do you have Quilter's Guide to Solids? Because
Quilter's Guide to Solids. And the answer is through volume, or through value,
and even saturation. Because white caps is a great example in here.
Yeah.
Where this is a quilt.
Well, that's hue.
But this. In white caps, I'm trying to get the glare off.
This is from a Quilter's Guide to Solids.
This is mostly blues and greens. And what we've done is placed lighter blues next to darker greens, duller greens next to brighter blues. So there's value contrast between, nothing's really like medium to dark in the blues and greens. And there are some that are intensely saturated and some that are slightly dull.
But I'll also add that in this, we've mentioned this before, those are navy and white,
The separator bars.
Yeah, the separator bars. Not black, because we wanted it to be a little bit more gentle. It's a little hard to see through the camera, but in person it was navy.
Now,
so go ahead.
I'll hold this when you talk.
So this is an example of, this is all teal in different values. So the background is this kind of, I think this is like cypress really now, if the Better Text ones that we carry. But all of these are kind of lighter teal, sage greens.
Or yellows with a little green in it.
Right. So this is an example where these are all similar in value because you need the value to be able to give you contrast with the edge here. And did I say this is the party of four pattern?
No,
I don't think I did. This is our party of four pattern. So it doesn't matter whether you have a tremendous amount of contrast in the four patch here, but all of these need to look like they're similar in value, but you need a good amount of contrast from the sashing and the border.
Yeah, and yet even within a square, I'm going to try to put one right here. We've got a stripe, a large scale print, a small scale print. There's great variety,
Yeah.
and alone, if you just cut those four pieces, you might say, these don't go together. However, when you put them together and you surround them by that dark,
High contrast.
either teal or cypress, high contrast, then
High
all of a
contrast in
sudden-
value, not in hue.
In hue.
So she was saying she doesn't like high contrast in hue, so she doesn't like orange and blue. She wants like blue and purple or blue and green. But the way to get the contrast is going to be through value, not hue.
And I actually packed several versions of Party of Four because it's an incredibly simple concept.
Mm-hmm.
But here is another version of it.
With our Victorian modern, I
Okay.
missed that line. I
I'll hold
love
this
that line.
back. And these are more pastel.
Yeah,
But-
I think if you can hold it a little bit closer so they can see the
Yeah.
colors.
Yeah.
And this was this is kind of, it printed definitely lighter than we actually drew it, but this is a line that really was about softness, and it was about being colorful, but not super bold and not super graphic. So we wanted a softness to it, but we still wanted that edge, as Bill, has mentioned, where you can see that each of these units of each of these four patches is crisp and graphic. So it was kind of,
Feels intentional.
it feels sort of sweet and salty at the same time.
Yeah.
It's soft, but it's still graphic enough. Okay, so Bill
now-
brought all of these parties of
because
four.
here's the
We have
twist.
so many of them.
We just showed you one where the contrast was a very light background and one where it was a much darker background. But because we're talking about contrast, there are times when we've chosen to have less contrast. And this party of four has much more subtle. You can still make out the four patch, but it's not nearly as intense as heightened contrast as the others. So this was made with,
Oh, the chambray.
this is a chambray, the sashing and border. And chambrays, if you've never used them, are a solid one color woven against an undyed kind of muslin color in the other. So when you get up close,
It's
from
kind
a
of like the
distance,
shirt
it
I'm
looks
wearing.
like a solid,
Yeah.
but up close, it is a heathered look. Yeah,
Yeah.
This is actually
Yeah,
like a linen.
linen chambray.
That's a nice shirt.
Thank you.
So, but this party of four, in each case, every time we made it, the goal was to have something that gave you enough edge that you saw those four coming together, but not, just each quilt is different.
But you want to make sure that the sashing and the binding colors are clear enough and that they're equal in the relationships to all the different fabrics in the party of four. You can't have one that looks like it's kind of,
The odd man out.
well, it's blending too much into the sashing, and the other that's very, very high contrast.
And back to the person who liked the analogous, here is an analogous party of
Oh
four.
yeah, exactly.
Which is all blues and greens, and I'll hold it up and you
This
can
is
talk.
these are Marcia Jersey fabrics that are long since gone. I love this quilt,
Oh, she's such a great fabric designer.
But you can see that we used an olive green as the backing, or as the, not backing, the sashing and border color. And this is what's really, this kind of leads into another question, which is how someone asked, how do I go about choosing background colors for sashing or borders or whatever other than white and cream?
Oh.
And this started out, just hold on for a sec. This started out that I was being asked this question so many times. This is maybe 15 years ago, that I started carrying around a bundle of neutrals that we had put together, that we were often neutrals that we found were unexpected. Would you mind holding that up again? And this olive green was among them. And it's unexpected, but it looks so great with that blue. And it's because it's more desaturated than the rest of the fabrics.
Yeah.
So often surrounding yourself with surrounding color with something desaturated makes the colors look more luminous. So this is kind of like the salted caramel effect, I call it. That, you know, the salt when eaten with the caramel makes the caramel taste sweeter. It's a very similar thing with color.
If there's too much salt, the ice cream is salty. So it's that little bit of desaturation. I brought issue 7 there because the cover talks about this exact same issue. This is our retro quilt, which uses all sorts of colored fabrics.
It's in this, okay.
Yeah. So I'm just trying to see. I've got a lot of glare.
Yeah.
There's a trick. For some reason, the camera is going a little dull today, but the olive green, it's kind of an army green, is a fabric that not many quilters would go to a quilt shop thinking like, oh, I need 5 yards of that. And yet we've used it all the time. And it goes back to the issue of contrast, that olive drab, army green is not in a lot of prints. And therefore it almost always provides good edge because it doesn't blend with, I mean, if I pulled out every single print in our stash, I'd say 98% of them don't have olive drab in it. And
well,
so
I think
gives you a nice edge.
I think the idea is if it has olive drab in it, then go for an even more desaturated version of that hue. So, and one of the things when we start, I was going back to carrying around this bundle that we used to teach with, and then I was in Florida teaching, and I went out of the room, and I came back, and somebody had cut a hole in one of my fat quarters that I was teaching. And I know, and without asking, and I thought, I called up Bill that night and I said, okay, if people are actually stealing fabrics that I'm bringing to teach, I think that means there's a demand for them. Yeah. So we started selling bundles of the most common background fabrics that aren't white and aren't cream and aren't black, but are useful, and that most people would not think of as being a background color.
And the bundle we had back then had lights and darks. Right now we have a light and medium bundle. We still have to do a dark bundle.
This is our essential solids bundle, and we say on the back of the tag there, these are all from Benartex's Superior Solids. And when Benartex started offering solids, we requested a whole bunch, pretty much this and some more. We requested a variety of unexpected neutrals. exactly for this situation where you want something that's a little bit different, that's not as high contrast
not
as
just
white or cream.
not just gray, but
black.
maybe a slight rose color, celadon.
This is
tint.
like a celadon. Again, it's hard to see with this light, but there's very subtle differences in, there's a greenish gray, and then there's a bluish gray, and then there's a gray taupe, and a kind of pale cafe au lait kind of color, and
Actually,
these are just extremely useful. And so what people do, many people buy this bundle from our website and write on the edge in a Sharpie what the color is based on the tag, and then they use that for auditioning background colors. And then if you want to order it online or see if your local quilt shop has it, you'll know whether, it just looks really different when you have a fat quarter of it versus you're looking at a little chip on a swatch card or something. So the essential solids are always, we often gravitate toward these
and
when we start looking for a background or seshing.
The key to almost all of them is they are all desaturated.
Yes.
That's one thing that they all share. And you can use desaturated tone-on-tone prints as well, but the solids are a great tool because you're just getting the pure color in a solid.
And I want to comment on Sue's comment in the chat that she's about to start a scrap quilt, and we've given her lots to think about. And I think if I were in the room with you, Sue, not that you asked, but I'm going to give you some advice anyway. If I were helping you with your scrap quilt, one of the things that I have done in teaching and that I find is just a recurring bit of advice that's useful is, once you've gotten your palette together, take out the lightest and put it in value order at some point, and take out the lightest and darkest fabrics and see whether the palette looks better at that point.
Or if it looks too flat.
If it looks too flat, yeah.
But extremes, I agree with Weeks. This is
often
what is most contrasting, and is that the lightest and the darkest, or the brightest, the most saturated,
right?
Or do you just have 2 oranges, but you have 20 greens and 20 reds and 20, we always say, is there someone who needs a friend at the lunch table? Right. That either you have to take out something because it stands out, or you have to give it more friends so it's not alone.
But if you have white to black, you can look, and there's a reason there isn't white in this quilt behind us.
Or black.
Well, there is black.
Tiny bit.
But then the other, all of these quilts that we've shown you today, none of them have both white and black in them. You can use white and black in a quilt.
Oh, and
sure.
we love black and white.
But if you have light to dark, meaning white to black, everything in between, and then you have all the colors in the rainbow, it starts to get a little visually, it can be a little too much. And sometimes just taking out the 2 lightest fabrics or the 2 darkest fabrics, or the lightest and darkest fabric, suddenly everything looks a little bit more cohesive.
It reminds me of kind of filters online. Let's say you're house shopping and you put your budget is $250,000 to $500,000. It gets rid of the $1 million mansions and the kind of
their shacks.
The shack. But it's similar when we're working on palettes for quilts. We rarely would say, well, we want every hue and we want every value and we want every saturation. It's like, no, we're going to put some parameters here, and maybe we'll have 60% of the hues, and we'll get rid of the lightest and the darkest, or the brightest, most saturated, most desaturated. That too many variables is often dizzying. If you're intentionally trying to do it, be aware of that. Yeah. And then you have to think about the structure and how you make sense of it all.
And if you're going to use black and white and you're going to use that value range, maybe tighten up the number of hues. Maybe, use it, don't have every color of the rainbow in there. Now, speaking of black and white, I do want to ask Lorraine in Australia, who said it's 3 a.m., so she's not going to be watching
watch
live.
later.
She asked to comment on organizing a color wash quilt for how do you organize the colors from light to dark? When do you organize them? Do you organize the blacks and the grays with the other colors, or do you separate them? And I think that black and white and gray can often look so different because it's so desaturated than other colors, that I would organize the colors first and then see whether you need any black or white in there, because they can kill.
They can stand out too much.
Because of the desaturation, because there's no saturation really for the most part in black or gray, that they can really make everything else look so much brighter than you want it to.
Or they can just draw too much attention to themselves.
Or is it a different role in the quilt? So I would organize all your colors first, unless you're making a gray and black quilt.
That's a different story.
But they're going to, just by virtue of saturation, they are going to have different roles in the quilt.
Absolutely.
Unless you have a ton of different colors that mediate between the grays and the colors. Which is going to be hard.
So I agree. I think they kind of play separately. And hi, Sue. I see, first, I'm going to get to Christine. Can yellow be used as a neutral? That's a great question. I would say if it's a desaturated, a very gentle yellow, actually because of the physics, the wavelength of yellow attracts a lot of attention. And in terms of the spectrum, the yellow wavelength is actually the smallest part of the spectrum that we see. So it has a very special role, and yellow goes green or orange very quickly. So if you have kind of a yellowy off-white or like a very pale butter.
The ecru in this kind of it's a yellowy white.
But it tends to go a little orange too. It's a tricky question. I think yellow is often talked about. It can be problematic because when it is saturated, it will always draw attention to itself. But the place where yellow is one of the best neutrals is as a quilting thread. Oh my gosh.
Pale yellow.
A pale yellow is, I think, one of the most versatile quilting threads because it kind of is a chameleon with whatever it goes over.
I think the answer to that question is yellow can be a neutral if it's more desaturated than the other fabrics in the quilt.
That's it.
Because
that's it.
It's not a matter of what the hue is, it's a matter of what the saturation is.
So a dusty pale yellow.
If it's a gold, like if it's a really muddy gold, that can be a neutral with navies, for example, or something like that. But you can look at a lot of the Civil War quilts that you'll see gold used, but highlighter yellow, I don't think
that's never going to be neutral.
Yeah, never going to be neutral, and that's why it's highlighter.
Yes.
Yeah, that's why it's used highlighter. Exactly.
And, okay, Sue, what you just wrote, Sue, in the comments for those who didn't see, I think my scrap pile is better off being 2 different quilts. Thanks. Okay,
it may be 5 different quilts.
Gold Star, in that one of the most common things we see when we see a finished quilt that seems a little confused is that there are 2 or more ideas going on. And even as we design, we often design quilts, come back to the design the next day and say, wait a minute, this is 2 different quilts. There is one that the color is perfect for a quilt, the form is perfect for a quilt, but not together. Or these are 2 separate stacks of fabric. So I think often recognizing, breaking down your ideas is a sense that you're really being reflective in a good way.
And I would say, Sue, that if I take the hundreds, probably thousands of people I've taught in workshops and the quilts the palettes I've seen, the number one mistake that I think most people make, and this may also just be a taste thing, it may not be a mistake because this is taste and preference, but the number one thing I think that I wish quilters would do is spend more time editing their palette, editing the roles that the fabric has to play, because I think there's a lot of great craftsmanship, but if the palette wants to be 2 or more quilts, there have been times that I have taught classes and I've said, this is 3 quilts, and I've put the fabric into 3 different piles, and then they're like, oh.
And then they're excited about 3 quilts.
Yeah, and then they're like, okay, I see it. But if there's too much of a difference, if you want to have a big range of colors and fabrics and styles, you have to have 50, 60 prints in order to be in it. But if you start getting into it's everything from white to black, every color of the rainbow, pastels to brights, then it just becomes visually a little much for me.
Yeah.
But it just like tighten up one of those.
I follow an online group called Maximalism, which, as someone who's a bit of a minimalist, I actually love when maximalism is done well. And yet I always look at photos. People post photos of rooms that have every inch covered. And most of them I find tremendously wonderful because there is editing going on.
But also there's one big gesture.
There's a big gesture.
Yeah.
There's something that makes it cohesive and not just, well, yeah, they're still dizzying, but yeah. So before I'm looking at the time, it's July. We do.
But hold on, Marie. This is our picnic quilt, and this is the kits are sold out. We still have some yarn dyes on our website, but this is a digital download on the Modern Quilt Studio website. Okay, so it's July, so we have a very unexpected palette for you, and which is very much in the spirit of contrast.
It is, and I think we have enjoyed doing the palette of the month with the Benartech solids because it makes us think about time, it makes us think about seasons. And in summer, there are very different approaches. There can be like, wow, the garden is in full bloom, we've got all these greens. But we started thinking about the other thing with summer and the kind of bleaching effect of strong sun. And so...
But also... I think it's important for the palettes that we do in the palette of the month to not look all the same. So this is the Driftwood palette, and this is all about neutrals, and it's different from our essential solids.
There are a couple
of overlap, but what we love about this palette, let's see if I can get it there for you, is that it's this very subtle mix. It's a soft palette. It's a soft palette meant for a low volume quilt. It could be paired. All of these could be paired with a navy blue or a charcoal gray for a higher, or jewel tones or something that could be. But I think jewel tones would kind of wreck it to me.
Yeah.
What I think would be nice is if you wanted a high contrast quilt, to go for a darker value fabric that you would add these, work on these with. But this is a very calm and
it's gentle
and soft.
Definitely right now we're about a mile from the beach, now, Lake Michigan, and the driftwood, which is everywhere, when you actually look at it up close, there's a lot going on in it.
Yeah.
It's not just gray. There are just beautiful undertones, and there's actually a fair amount of value in there from light to dark. And so this bundle has, I'm going to quickly
read. 10
read.
fat quarters.
Rose gold, flint, moss, chamois, light khaki, storm, ecru, sage, latte, and putty.
We'll post this on social media too.
This is live on our site right now because I turned on the automation for it to go live, but I didn't check on it yet, so I'm not sure if it worked. If not, I will post this.
And I'll post it on a visual of it on social media too.
And because we're not in our studio, I know that the color is going to be a little different on screen. I will post later on, I don't know if it'll be today or when we get back next week, but as always, we'll post this to YouTube, and I think that the color will be, we use a different camera at the same time, so the color is going to be a little different in each, but on our website, you'll definitely be able to see a color-corrected version of this.
Yes. So,
oh yeah, happy
Canada Day.
Yeah.
So that is the July Quilts First, and we hope that you get some time off this weekend.
We're going to recharge, and even though it's a vacation, we brought our sewing machine with us to kind of leisurely, and it's fun. It's
we have several projects.
We have dueling quilts. We're each working on a quilt right now. We do.
So we hope that you enjoyed today's Quilts First, and we'll see you on August 1st. And as always, do let us know if there is something that you would like us to talk about in a future Quilts First. And we hope you enjoy making something this weekend.
Thanks for joining us.
Take care.
Bye-bye.